but also S's, all tucked away inside the Global Terrorism Index. And looking at the largest increase in deaths from terrorism 2021 to 2022, they're all also given illustrations here. But I wanted just to show you the list here and see where Kenya is at right now. Looking at this particular list, Afghan tops the country. If you look at the first countries where we have that color, which is maroon, these are countries where we have the very high incidences of terror attacks. And then on the red as well, I can try and zoom in so that we can flow together just to show you. Led there by Afghanistan, which has this particular score, 8.822. And then we have followed by Burkina Faso, Somalia, Mali. Those are at least 3 African countries: Syria, Pakistan, Iraq, Nigeria, Myanmar, Niger is number 10, Cameroon number 11, Kenya is number 20 at 6.163. Followed by Iran, Yemen, Turkey, Indonesia 24, Israel at 5, and Thailand. So we are not in a good place as far as terrorism is concerned. Looking at this global index, terrorism index that we do have here, and that is a total terrorism deaths by country. Also is given here, 2021 to 2022, total deaths from terrorism fell almost 9% from 2021 to 2022. And Afghan is leading, followed by Pakistan and Somalia, Mali, Burkina Faso, and other countries as well. And so we want just to discuss, especially in light of what really happened yesterday in Lamu. We begin with you, Dr. Hassan Kanenje. Number 20, Kenya listed there. What do you think?
You know, I like when I think of Kenya to think about tourism, not to think about Kenya, then think about terrorism. But those two things, sometimes they are very closely connected, because part of the rationale for Al-Shabaab also attacking Kenya and kidnapping our tourists initially was pretty much to try and kill our economy, because they know how reliant Kenya was on the tourist sector. And of course, the recent attacks do not help that cause. At number 20, sitting between Iran and the Philippines, or is it Chad? And sitting between, I think, Chad and Iran. Of course,
Iran, Yemen, and Chad, yes.
Yemen and Chad,
Philippines on 18.
Well, I didn't know we'll be doing worse than Yemen, because when you think about
Yemen...
Surprised
myself.
Yes, you know. But that also explains or underscores the need for the continued, fight against the problem we face. Perhaps a topic that is connected to this: the heads of state will be meeting in November 30th to potentially discuss Somalia's admission into the East African community. Part of the problem and why we are at number 20 is because Somalia is the epicenter of Al-Shabaab. Now, what will that also mean for us? And it is a question that I don't think citizens and a lot of Kenyans have been interrogating very clearly. Somalia is a natural member of the East African community. It's the only other country of the 4 countries that still use the shilling. Even though you need a lot more shillings, the end to buy bread. Don't kill me for this. But the continuing threat that this Al-Shabaab poses, as well as other groups, while ISIS is having a presence in East Africa generally, especially in parts of Somalia, DRC, in the name of Allied Democratic Forces and Mozambique, has not been very active in Kenya, but that does not mean it cannot be able to make it another theater. Now, the effort And one of the success we've had or we've registered in Al-Shabaab, especially when it comes to radicalization, has been community engagement. In certain hotspots like Isiolo, right now those incidents are very few. But then also the big problem we have is ensuring that Kenyans play an active role in this problem. Because I can tell you this, even those attacks in Lamu, there's someone who knew about it, but did not say. There's someone who was housing somebody, but did not say. Either out of complacency, out of fear, or out of ignorance with regard to the potential consequences. The moment you start, you have a bad relationship with the state that is supposed to be protecting you, and either as individually or as an individual or as a community, you don't work towards it, and those also, let's say, state actors do not work to bridge that gap, it creates a dysfunction that allows terror to grow and thrive. And so the reason I mentioned Somalia's entry into this community, because that is going to require that we have to loosen a lot of some of the border restrictions and movements of goods, people, and services. What that is going to mean is there is a likelihood that if we are not vigilant, but we don't set in place frameworks that's going to ensure that, number one, we degrade and deny Al-Shabaab ability to recruit, to train, to collect taxes and money to run, in there, that problem is going to be exported fully onto our soil. And that problem may get worse. So even as we negotiate this, what mechanisms are we doing as a country and as a region to ensure that actually Somalia becomes more peaceful? President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud, you mentioned the amnesty that he offered, and that is a way to entice some fence-sitters perhaps cross over Al-Shabaab. But as a region, we've relied heavily on foreign help in trying to conduct our affairs in Somalia. That has to change, because the world, especially the Western partners who've been supporting a lot of our missions, most of their focus right now is towards Eastern Europe, especially in Ukraine. And as much as we're going to make noise about this problem, this is going to be our problem. We have to take ownership, which means members of IGAD countries, for instance, and African Union, we need to come up with a framework of funding missions and supporting structures within Somalia, supporting structures and missions within Eastern DRC, for instance. Since MONUSCO is leaving, there's going to be a vacuum. And Kenyan forces have actually has done a tremendous job that has not been communicated sufficiently. And that in part explains the kind of hostility sometimes we're facing from DRC. A lot of it because even the citizens there, they don't understand. They don't telling the difference between what MONUSCO was doing and what, for instance, the Kenyan forces are doing. M23 has been able to withdraw from a lot of sectors there voluntarily without even fighting, you see. But then that has to be followed with a political process. The Nairobi process kind of stalled at some point. So if we don't solve the political process there and solve some of the economic and social and political process in Somalia to ensure that Al-Shabaab not have a reservoir where to recruit from, and they don't have the grievance that has kept them going, is going to be challenging. So we need to be able to bring minds together and face the reality in the region, that we need to coordinate our efforts, but at the same time, we need to start relying more on ourselves and our own resources to be able to execute this war, even as we seek foreign partners. Just perhaps the final point to underscore in this, the reason I'm pushing more on local mechanisms and local funds to do this, African Union budget is about $600 million. Most of it is actually funded from outside. IGAD budget is about maybe $175 million. 60 or 70% of it is funded from outside. How can we be able to have African solutions to African problems, but with foreign money, without African money? It's going to be very, very difficult. So Kenya, as a thought leader and as a leader in diplomacy and economics in this region, I think we need to start leading the process, at least regionally, as we try to mobilize the countries to ensure that we fight and destroy this problem once and for all.
All righty. Let's just hear from Irungu Houghton. That issue of amnesty And of course, this is not with amnesty.
Yeah, no, we've not been offered.
We've not been offered
to
anyway.
Al-Shabaab.
Do you think also it's sort of an inducement, because we've seen amnesties never really work, especially when we are calling out, people who have illegal arms to try and bring those arms. Al-Shabaab, would they really show up with this gesture that is coming from the president and the amnesty?
So there's a young woman called Malala, or a young person called Malala, not the one who is the Secretary General of UDA, but the one from Afghanistan. I think Yousafzai is her surname. And she has this phrase that says...
The Nobel laureate.
The Nobel laureate, indeed. She says it is education, not guns, that will kill terrorism. And I think there is something about that has wisdom, in the sense that ultimately it is not a military exercise, it is a developmental exercise. But I think what we've learned is it's not just development. So terrorism is not born just from deprivation and poverty. It is also born from extremism and polarization. And I think the other side of that argument in terms of education is really building an appreciation for diversity, an appreciation for democratic institutions, non-violent ways of persuading society to your view. And I think that's the framework. So in that context, amnesties are important, because what they do is they may not destroy or degrade the capability of the entire Al-Shabaab or the ISIS community, but what it does is it begins to draw people away from violence and towards non-violent, more civil ways of being that respects each other. So I think that would be my initial response. Coming back to the case, that we were horrified to see again, the two people who were killed in Lamu yesterday. The fact that we are ranked 20th in the world order, is a painful reminder that actually there are communities that live under the threat of terrorism in this country, right? Not in far-flung Afghanistan, where, for example, former British High Commissioner Jane Marriott was dispatched. So I think one of the things I've always been curious about, coming back to the diplomatic community, is where do the diplomats come from, and where do they go after they leave Kenya? And if they come from countries which have been polarized, the states are unstable, there is high levels of conflict, then I worry about how the international community sees Kenya. And maybe your bell is not enough to reassure them. But I think for me, the thing that's really important is to remember that these communities are facing this level of violence. And also our law enforcement agents, our police officers are always out on patrol, wondering whether an IED explosive will be their last moment. And I think just to, as we mark the Global Terrorism Index release, is just to honor the courage of both communities and police in terms of fighting, and I guess our counterterrorism, forces in terms of rolling back this terror.
Right. Let's hear from Professor Nomidamba.
There were several important points to remember here. Number one is we welcome the inclusion of Somalia. Hasi and I have been talking about this for a long time, so that Somalia is integrated as part of the East Africa community. And my hope is that we can also follow that by closing the dark camp. So to allow those folks to either choose to be Kenyan citizen or transfer back to Somalia smoothly without any condition, or go to other places. But that camp need to be closed, because that camp is one of the source of recruitment site. And then we need to really now seriously be ready with the substantive counter-terrorism measure, budget by each country from the internal standpoint, not the US, not somewhere else, not Europe. We need to be serious about this, because we cannot develop with these folks in our midst. Where they come from, how they were recruited, how they got involved, that's not not our business. We need to put a stop to it. Now, what this is going to do, Dubal, is the force in Somalia, the African Peace Force in Somalia, are seen as outsider. You know, they're not Somalia, they're coming here. And Al-Shabaab can recruit, really powerful recruitment team. We got to get rid of these foreigners who are invading our country. This force I'm talking about is going to be an internal force, an East African force, accepted by every country. They're not invading, they're integrated as part and parcel of the East Africa Peace Corps. And Somalia is part of it, Tanzania is part of it, everyone is part of it. And therefore, if we fully fund it and be behind it, we will begin now to find the source of the recruitment, where it's coming from, and then begin using education instead of guns in order to eliminate these people.
Right. Hamedashi.
Well, the great Cameroonian writer Mongo Betty, I don't know if one remembers that.
Very famous.
From Cameroon.
Yeah.
He wrote this book I read a long time ago. It's called The Culture of Unhappiness, I believe. He said, you know, if you got a wheel and you turn it on the same rut, now you can fix the wheel if it breaks down. But if the ruts in the wheel are the old ones and it keeps moving in the same direction, you know, the unhappiness follows. So I think that Somalia is a story of unhappiness. And why is it a story of unhappiness? Because the history of this country and where it is now has produced a form of barbarism that I think ought not to be accepted. And what is that barbarism, Debal? Statelessness causes barbarism. Every kind of problem flows out of statelessness. When the ideas of a just order, civilized society, and a progressive community that wants to attempt to get out of barbarism, it is the responsibility of its neighbors to help. And we in Kenya are doing that. We're really trying to help. The problem is, Debal, that the Somalis have to help themselves. And unless they begin to help themselves, Debal, this problem of statelessness will go for another 30 years. And then people like Newt Gingrich are going to say, we don't need governments. Debal, it is very important for the world community to end these types of statelessness, because that is where terrorism comes from. The marshes, as it were, have to be drawn. And in that way, we can create citizens, that confounded concept from the French Revolution, that can act in a certain way, Debal. The way things are going now is that we're not creating citizens. We're creating barbarism. And we cannot have a state in Kenya or hope to have an East African community while some of the countries in the East African community in a miasma of conflict. And Debal, the core issue in Somalia is leadership. The core leadership. Nothing more than that, Debal. The political class in Somalia, Debal, is not only failed, it has, it's in the mud. I've cited the example of Colonel Musa Bihi in Hargeisa. It's complete failed. Has failed in the security area, failed in the economic area, failed in the social area. The president of Somalia himself, Mr. Hassan Sheikh, is involved in military affairs somewhere in the middle of Somalia. Debal, as I've said before, all the regions in Somalia are being led by people who shouldn't be leading them. The leaders, there are leaders. There are many, many, many leaders from Somalia. They're outside the country. They're inside the country. And the Somali people have to stand up for themselves, as they have done for centuries and thousands of years before, and say we're going to put an end to this crisis. And once they put an end to that crisis, Debal, we can help them build the institutions. But charity has to begin at home, and they have to build their own country and not expect other people to build it for them.
All right. Crisis is also on the climate, and we have global experts who are meeting in Nairobi ahead of the upcoming COP28 climate change conference in Dubai. The two-day meeting that started on Tuesday is organized by the Global Center for Policy and Strategy, GLOSEP, led by Dr. Robert Kabage. The event ends today under the rallying call, "The future is green," and it seeks to influence the trajectory of climate change action strategies for sustainable progress in Eastern Africa. The meeting will also inform the upcoming Africa Climate Summit running from September 4th to 6th in Nairobi, themed "Shaping the Future of Climate Change Action Plans for Sustainable Development in Eastern Africa." The conference is featuring many speakers, Government and National Security Advisor Monica Juma, who is the chief guest, and of course also the East Africa Arid and Semi-Arid Lands CS Rebecca Miano, who are attending. Let's just listen in.
Not so long ago, climate change, to a good majority, seemed merely an obsession of restless scholars out to explore and test the horizons of science. But today, that is not anymore. That reality brings me to a curious assertion made by former US President Barack Obama during the first session of COP21, the UN Climate Change Summit on the 23rd of September 2014 in New York, and I will quote him, "We are the first generation to feel the impact of climate change and the last generation that can do something about it."
There is a growing recognition of the nexus between climate crisis and security. Across the world today, the tendency is to begin to securitize the climate space. In the 2021 report, World Climate and Security Report by the International Military Council of Climate and Security, there is a very deep analysis of the multiple crisis security risks that we face. Given the scale of the effect of the adverse weather conditions, countries are being forced to draw on, for example, and to deploy their entire security assets and capabilities in order to respond to recurrent emergencies and disaster at a scale we have never known before.
Interesting nexus there of climate change and security as it is right now. It's the biggest threat ever because of migration. We've seen also what is happening with the immigrants who are trying to make sure that their lives are getting better, crossing over the seas to try and live their dreams at the end of the day. But just in light of that conference that is happening, especially on the menace of climate change, just briefly before we head to BRICS in South Africa, what will be happening there as well. Let's just begin with you, Dr. Kanenje. What Monica Juma has just stated, the nexus that people never see it, but climate change is a big threat to security as well.
Actually, I want to give kudos to GLOSEP for organizing this. In May, the HAN Institute organized a symposium on climate and change and security and migration nexus within the Horn of Africa region. And it is something that is not especially appreciated by policymakers on the continent as well as scholars in terms of doing research and seeing the connection. If there is a region on the continent that is suffering from actual impact of climate change, it is the Horn of Africa region, as well as, of course, the Sahel region, but critically the Horn of Africa region, where, as a result of climate, not only have you seen migration, but increase in security. Back in 2021, Kenya sought to, present, I think they presented a motion at the United Nations to frame climate change as a threat to international peace and security. Of course, that motion, because there were some big players in the United Nations Security Council who did not exactly agree with that idea, fell apart. But Kenya was determined, of course, to push that agenda. And I'm encouraged by the current president's commitment, to pushing the climate agenda, but also ensuring they extract certain commitments, especially from developed partners. Now the question is, are we doing what we are preaching? Are we drinking wine, and then we're preaching, or rather, we're preaching wine and drinking water at the same time? And the reason I'm saying this, anybody who comes, especially from outside Nairobi and from the countryside of Kenya, we know that our rivers are drying very fast. Our main tributaries that are supplying water to our citizens, the wells have run dry. The little springs are no longer in existence. And that has a lot to do with the way we've actually been dealing with our forestation. The truth is, we are not better off right now than we were before when it comes to ability to mitigate certain aspects of climate change. Now, one thing I would like to advise, whether the politicians or those outside, that our actions, especially with regard to climate, should always and must always necessarily be informed by science and evidence. So any policy has to reflect the reality, not because it's popular, but actually because it can save our environment. Because as the world comes to us, and as Africa comes to us in 2 weeks' time, or I think a week's time, you know, are they going to find that Kenya is practicing what it's preaching? And I'm afraid to say, in a number of aspects, we are not exactly doing what we actually trying to preach or expecting the rest of the world to do in support of us. We need to do more. And even the discussion, especially on trees and forestation, I think we need to revisit it and look at the actual data, for instance. How has it worked? What will be the potential consequences, so that we can move ahead and say, well, now this is safe to deal with this at this stage, but this is not safe to do. But at moving ahead with, let's say, the kind of actions that are damaging, not also educating our citizens to know the importance of that. So they wake up and their soils are dry, they're infertile, they don't have water, but they don't know the reasons why. If we don't invest in those efforts, I think whatever we are doing right now at a national macro level is going to bear very little fruit.
And human rights violation are bound to also continue pace when the menace of climate change. I don't know what can be the nuance that you can tell us, just a reflection of climate change and human rights.
So we touched on this a couple of hours ago, but for those that were still asleep and not viewing us, I think, you know, we know that the world is at a critical juncture. In fact, I think the phrase that you used was not global warming, but global burning. Boiling. Or burning. Is it burning or boiling? Boiling. Maybe both. So there have been lots of wildfires, for example, in the last 3 to 6 months in different parts of the world. So I think we are seeing intense competition for natural resources, for pasture, for agricultural potentially, agrarian land, and all of this is really at the source of some of the violence, even in the context of big complex conflicts like, for example, in Darfur, Sudan. There are also resource wars. So I think, the sooner that we can reduce the impact of global boiling on Africa, the quicker we will be able to see growth in the economy. And it's, of course, even more complicated in the context of the war in Ukraine, which I guess we'll come to in the context of the BRICS conference.
Indeed. Right.
The most important aspect of this is that every single individual, every single child got to be able to connect the issue that there is a real, true global boiling. And until we reach that point, and that's the point we need to drive to the citizen, we need to think about our human settlement. We are spreading out, we are cutting the trees, and then turning probably the land for food. We're turning it into concrete wall. We're doing that in Kiambu here, and then our policies are not connected to our behavior. They're not reaching us. And therefore, we see it as a government policy. We don't see it as this directly impacting. And therefore, we need to do much more. We need to do more education to our citizens. Families need to do more recycling, understanding fundamental why we need to recycle instead of polluting the rivers and waters that we drink. We need to be wise about the use of resources that we have and how we can be able to work together, in both in cities and rural country in order to be able to feed the people. Food security is number one, and you cannot talk to an hungry person. You can use whatever language you have, but when somebody is hungry, they're hungry. They need food. We need to be able to produce food where we have. If Israel can produce food in the desert, we can produce food in Kenya.
All right, let's hear from Ahmed Ashi briefly on that.
We have to stop invoking the human condition on the issue of climate change, because the Americans and the Europeans have burnt fossil fuel and messed up this world. We want to burn fossil fuel and create manufacturing, create jobs and housing. They're telling us you cannot burn anything more because we have done the burning. So what are we going to do for our development, Debal? How are we going to create jobs in this country or in this region or in this continent? We can't all move to the United States or Europe. So Debal, what the issue here is that the people who burnt the fossil fuel, the people who sent the carbon monoxide up into the air and caused this climate change are the culprits who are responsible. And we shouldn't be sitting with them and talking about solutions. They should be telling us how they're going to change this issue of climate change through financing a new global order. Because if we continue in the current global order, Debal, of manufacturing and burning fossil fuels, the world is going to go kaput. So Debal, we need to be very serious because we are the ones who are producing the oxygen that is stopping the earth from collapsing. Debal, here in the DRC, we have one of the lungs of the world. If we cut all the trees in the DRC, there is going to be drought in the entire United States. Debal, we ought to be very blunt and very clear with the Americans and Europeans about what is going on. And now the Chinese have come up, have done the industrialization. So what are they going to tell us? How are we going to provide jobs for our people? So this climate issue, Debal, is not about climate credit. This is about a historical sit down of trying to understand who's responsible, who then should be at the forefront of trying to help to fix this problem, and what kind of new global template do we need for changing this issue of climate change.
All right, we need also to see what is happening as far as we're talking about climate change with the artificial intelligence that is a threat to security as well. And there is a digital army that is being proposed by the United Nations. We have, and they're saying that with smartphones, editing apps, and innovative approaches, some UN peacekeeping operations across the world are building a digital army aimed at combating mis- and disinformation on social media networks and beyond, designing ways to fight back against falsehoods that can trigger tensions, violence, or even death. The UN has been monitoring how mis- and disinformation and hate speech can attack health, security, stability, as well as progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. It has become clear that business as usual is not an option. This is what the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said in a policy brief launched in June on information integrity on digital platforms. Let's just listen in and thrash out that matter.
New technology is moving at warp speeds, and so are the threats that come with it. Alarm bells over the latest form of artificial intelligence, generative AI, are deafening. And they are loudest from the developers who designed it. The scientists and experts have called on the world to act, declaring AI an existential threat to humanity on a par with the risk of nuclear war. We must take those warnings seriously. Our proposal Global Digital Compact, New Agenda for Peace, and Accord on the Global Governance of AI will offer multilateral solutions based on human rights. But the advent of generative AI must not distract us from the damage digital technology is already doing to our world. The proliferation of hate and lies in the digital space is causing grave global harm now. It is fueling conflict, death and destruction now. It is threatening democracy and human rights now. It is undermining public health and climate action now.
That's the reality of it. Of course, Time Magazine had also the artificial intelligence by the people for the people. And this is the new reality that we are in as well. And I'll try and see the latest copy of Science magazine that also showcases how truth and lies will be the biggest battle that we need to decipher. Misinformation and disinformation moving forward, that will be a big battle as well. Also, we shall be looking at, just as we prepare to wind up, busted in Georgia. Why his fourth indictment is the most dangerous for Trump. He was busted in Georgia, and you know, of course, what has been happening so far as his presidential candidacy is concerned. There are some mulling all over there, if you may look at that. And we have also the latest copy of Foreign Affairs. And they're asking that poignant question, tell me how this ends. Is there a path to victory in Ukraine? That is the latest copy of the Foreign Affairs as well. But let's just focus on the digital army that the United Nations is warning us of, the digital misinformation and disinformation. We had our harvesting of data, of the irises here. Not the actual irises, but
the data.
The data.
I think just to kick this conversation off, we are living in, as the Chinese would say, very interesting times. I think it is very welcome that the UN is now stepping into this space very firmly. I think it's a bit of it's a bit confusing to call for an army of peacekeepers for disinformation. It seems like those are three very distinct constituencies. Peacekeepers do not go to war. But stepping over that, I think we have to welcome the United Nations. Of course, Kenya is at the epicenter of this great debate, and it is, you know, and there are many reasons for this, but I think the most important really is the government's commitment to digitization of services. Perhaps not the Talanta Hewa app, but a number of other services that are in place at the moment. We're also facing a growing fatigue and a growing concern that the information that is shared on several social media applications are false and that are generally generated essentially to confuse us, to whip us into a state of moral hysteria, and generally create more skepticism and cynicism of public institutions. So just to give you an example, Facebook is currently in a Kenyan court on 2 counts. TikTok has been banned in Somalia. There are national legislators calling for TikTok to be banned in Kenya. Twitter, which is now known as simply X, are now deliberating or exploring the use of photographs and photo state IDs to verify the identities of specific handles and users, which means that for those of us who would want to be verified on X, it still sounds funny, on X, we would have to give our passports and a photo ID. To do this, and I think that is a matter of concern. Let's come to WorldCoin. WorldCoin managed to get 350,000 Kenyans to give their biodata, their biometric data, by looking into their WorldCoin orb, which is a little scanner, and they sold their iris data for about 7,000 shillings. 350,000 people. Many of them gave this information away at KICC, our national symbolic icon of a building, which is less than probably 50 meters from the High Court, the County of Nairobi. I don't know what other, Harambee Avenue, Harambee House, the legislature,
Senate.
so right under the nose of the governance institutions and the presidency, this took place. And of course, we look forward to seeing what the parliamentary committee will determine of this process. But I think what we have to say is that we live in a very dangerous moment in terms of the potential of artificial intelligence to really undermine independent thought for automated controlled thought. That the information that is now possible, the ability to introduce mass surveillance technology is actually beyond the control of human beings. It is now self-generating. And I think that's the greater danger that we have. It's not necessarily going to produce better digital citizens. It may actually produce more illiterate, digitally illiterate digital citizens.
And even right now, they're mulling over on installing memories in this, I don't know, sort of a human brain memory here. With the artificial, to the bots, the artificial intelligence as well. Where are we headed? They're saying we'll have half human, half robots. They call them the chimeras. Soon we'll be seeing the chimeras.
There's a Kikuyu word called chimera. I don't know if that is linked somehow.
If you look at this, and the number of particular young people that get really excited about new things, particular digital, then majority of our people who don't even look at computer understand the basic of it. And so what kind of future are we creating about? What kind of education system are we creating? What kind of society are we creating for the future? And how can we have control over this? Because Trump is an example in America. Disinformation and misinformation, which become valued as a value end. This is the way, the norm. This is the way we need to behave. These are facts. Okay, and so the timing in terms of our development, because we're really at the bottom, we're just about to take off. How are we going to do it? And so the country, the ball in terms of our education system, need to be entrenched to help non-digital and digital army that we already have. And how we can be able to work, parents with their children, and school system with the student. The young people, the world, can stay all night now without sleeping, and then in the morning they are dysfunctional in the classroom. They cannot understand. Japanese kids can play video game all night until their veins break in the morning when they wake up. How can we have control over our society if this is the trend, this is the way it is? It is here with us.
It is here with us, and of course, looking at the latest copy of a Scientific American as well, is all about truth versus lies. The science of misinformation and deception, and how to know what's real. Facebook and Twitter are polarizing society, counteracting anti-science thinking, battling disinformation. The psychology behind conspiracy theories, implicit bias, affects our realities.
I think that the most basic way is to produce citizens who have gone through an educational system that is critical, so that any person who faces this knowledge is able to discern whether it is good or bad, whether it is true or false. We can sit and look at a piece of information and we have an alarm bell inside our heads that says this is not right, because of the critical education that we have had. But we ought not to have this idea in our heads that we just keep following whatever Europe does. This is nonsense, Deba. I think we ought to make sure that our governments, our civil society, and our intellectual leaders find a way in which there's transformation in this continent, so we don't have to rely nor react to the creations that have come from Europe or North America.
Thank you.
I think that everybody should know that the internet and the cell phone was readily available to John Fitzgerald Kennedy during the Berlin crisis. So these are things that have just been brought into the political economy of the world.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. So we need to wind up on that as well. Let's hear from. I
comments.
wanted you to comment especially on the bastard in Georgia with American politics. Why his fourth indictment is the most dangerous for Trump?
No, first of all, I can't help but, first of all, I want to complain. I'm yet to receive my 7,000 from WorldCoin. So I'm waiting for it.
They harvested from you as well.
Yes, yeah. Now,
let us talk after this. I need to do something before you bring not just your eyes, but your teeth, your hair, and your nose. That's a mapua.
Your dental formula.
Yes.
Last comments?
AI, just like the invention of the discovery of the atom, we can elect to use it for good or for bad, or sometimes for both. Now, artificial intelligence has been a game changer in lots of areas. It's still going to remain relevant in the years to come. It's part of what's even shaping the kind of discussions and the way it's being transmitted, by this media, right now. Now, there's a discussion about banning TikTok, but how can we be discussing about banning TikTok when we're creating a board for TikTok queens in this country? Is that not contradictory? For TikTok, we can manage the kind of content that is going to be posted out there so it's not harmful. But we should also be careful with regard to certain civil liberties as well as freedoms of speech and expression. So to what extent are we going to go? Now, this indictment in Georgia is very serious for Donald Trump, in part because it looks like someone has a smoking gun. But as typical as it is with the United States, it's a very litigious society. And a lot of times, the bigger the lawyers you have, the more you can draw out things and literally split the case wide open. And as I mentioned last week, at the end of the day, because of the politically charged nature of this case and everything surrounding it, and the nature of the Supreme Court ultimately that is largely conservative, I can see Donald Trump probably walking away. As unfortunate as it is.
I agree with you.
He may
100%.
walk away, and don't be surprised on January 20th of 2024 to see Donald Trump in the White House.
Yep, I agree with you 100%.
So we have to deal with reality.
We have to deal with reality.
I concur.
Okay, we need to wind up. Rungu Houghton.
Yeah, you move to Mars.
Yeah, we need just to give our closing remarks. Yes, please. Let's begin with Rungu Houghton.
Actually, I would cede to my colleague on the left and then take it
Well, we have a beautiful country. We are, if you travel the way we have traveled around the world, and we need to have a sense of harmony and sense of value. We need to be careful with the words we use about each other and about the country. And we need to be able to take care of it like a baby in order for it to take care of us. If we don't, we are all going down the hill.
All right, Ahmed Ash.
Well, Jabal, I think that we have to keep our eyes on Niger. The transformation in the Sahel is a watershed event in African history. If there is an ECOWAS shooting one, I don't think there will be. That is going to be a disaster. There needs to be a completely new template on the relations between the Sahel, West Africa, and our partners in Europe and in the United States. That's to change.
Right, thank you. Dr. Kanenje, briefly.
Dibal, Kenya is an exceptional country, and our leaders should know that everything they say the world is watching. And that privilege of exceptionalism is not guaranteed. We can lose it very quickly and lose the country in the process.
Thank you, thank you. Rungu Houghton, finally.
It's an important week for the criminal justice system. The nomination of Renison Ngonga as possibly the next DPP or the Director of Public Prosecutions. He goes for vetting, I think, next week. And behind him, of course, is an institution that has seen quite a bit of transformation in terms of digitization, in terms of, I guess, fierce independence of its fierce protection of its independence as a prosecution arm of the government. We hope that the vetting is rigorous and that also that he comes through that process successfully with a clear mandate to continue to serve the public from a human rights perspective.
Thank you. I want to thank you. Professor Noami Damba Hamid Hashi, thank you very much. Also, Dr. Hassan Kanenja, thank you for coming through. I think a very incisive and insightful discussion we've had today. Just regarding matters of foreign policy, diplomacy, and security, we continue to keep it locked here as far as those developments are concerned, and we interrogate also deeply why we are at number 20 as a country.